Greetings, everyone. It's been about 2 months since my last podcast episode. I think it was actually more like closer to three. Um, so this is the first podcast of the new year, and I know it's March. I actually intended to record this during April, but um, I didn't exactly find the time. Today, I'll be reviewing the book African Founders by David Hackett Fischer. And I've reviewed his previous book from over 30 years ago, Albion's Seed, which goes into detail of what he considers to be the four founding cultures, or he used the term folkways, and he wasn't the first one to use that term either. But the four folkways uh, um, that came to North America, the British ones, anyways. And I'll just review what those are. The first ones was the Puritans who came to Massachusetts, and um, their culture is throughout New England, although not all of them are agreed with the Puritans, or the should I say the Congregationalists in Massachusetts. For example, Rhode Island is composed of Baptists, and Connecticut's composed of separatists, at least historically. And the second group would be the Anglicans who went to the Chesapeake Bay. Oh yeah, the first group originated in East Anglia, so eastern England, specifically 7 counties. I don't remember their names. Um, and they were essentially the Roundheads during the English Civil War. They were against the king. Meanwhile, the Cavaliers from the south and west of England were fought for the king, and they went to Virginia. Like I said, the Chesapeake Bay, and you can say that the Catholics in Maryland are also part of that cultural group. And yeah, Virginia and Massachusetts were at each other's throats during the English Civil War, and it was then that the roots of the American Civil War, or the War for Southern Independence, were planted. The seeds, of that war were planted during the English Civil War. Then you get the third group. That would be the Quakers from the Northern Midlands. So not the of so not the northern border of England, but the northern part of the Midlands mostly. Um, I was reading this one paper about how there were actually Quakers all over, spread thinly all over England, and yeah, those guys didn't really like the Puritans either. They wanted to do their own thing, and so they went to the Delaware Valley, which um, includes Pennsylvania and West Jersey. West Jersey being like, imagine New Jersey, but then the West is culturally in line with Pennsylvania. Well, um, certain northern part of Maryland and Delaware. Um, and then these guys, this third group, the Quakers, they became a minority before the American War for Independence, and because other, not just English Christians, but even Germans, German Mennonites, were also consisted of a pretty large group, and yeah, the English Quakers became a minority before the American War for Independence, like even like around 1760. Is when I don't remember the exact date. Like what date you can put specifically to say this is when they became the minority, but they were always about religious pluralism. David Hackett Fischer called it reciprocal liberty. If New England believed in um, a communitarian liberty or ordered liberty, and he and Virginia believed in uh, hegemonic liberty, as in this aristocratic nobility would have the liberty, and it would trickle down. Then the Pennamites, you could he doesn't use that word, but the Pennamites believed in reciprocal liberty, because they would allow other people religious close to religious freedom as long as you believed in the one Almighty God. That you it would be close to religious freedom for everyone. And then the fourth group were the borderlanders. Um, the border, who dwelled between the border of England and Scotland. So this includes the Scottish lowlanders, but not the Highlanders. And then some of those borderlanders went to Ireland, well, mostly Ulster, for like one or two generations, and then they went to the Appalachian Mountains, and they were a warrior culture, and he in the Albion Seed, David Hackett Fischer refuses to call the the Quakers in the Delaware Valley anarchists, but he's okay with using that word or to to describe the borderland culture because they wanted to be left alone. Essentially, these guys were closer to anarchists. Well, I mean, which is kind of weird for some people to think because they tend to war. They're warriors, but you need a state, at least statism, and often comes with war. But that's basically it. Well, the four cultures. If you go through Albion Seed, you're gonna realize, wait a minute, where is New York? Because what is the main culture of New York? Because when you read about the Puritans, yeah, they were in upstate New York, but what about the rest of New York? And then near the end, he talks about New Netherland and how Martin Van Buren is a product of New Netherland culture. I mean, his first language was Dutch, but yeah, New York used to be New Netherland before the English took over, and New York City used to be called New Amsterdam. So he in African Founders, he goes through the four cultures of how they treated the different Africans and how some colonies tended to have Africans from different parts of Africa. And so I don't remember all of those places. It's a pretty dense book. I say that I was listening to the audiobook. But let's go through how each of the cultures, how each of the British folkways affected the African founders. Well, the African culture, or he uses the word African American, and I'll get to that term towards the end. Um, so the first he talks about New England, how New in New England, the slaves surprisingly had a lot of freedom. I mean, if you compare it to South Carolina, which I'll get to later. But the slaves there were even allowed to elect their own leaders in this and they had their own like celebrations for a few days in New England. And of course, when you think of New England, even some slaves, especially from Rhode Island, had fought during the American War for Independence. Initially, George Washington had banned blacks and other types of people from serving in the military, but then later on, they were welcome, especially in Rhode Island. And yeah, they were also, some of them were even allowed to be baptized. Um, like when I think of New Englanders, I think, um, well, this is not fair because I was about to say Frederick Douglass, but he was actually from Maryland. But he did experience discrimination in the 30s and 40s when he was in Massachusetts. Certainly, um, Jim Crow is where it started in the North, and it's not fair to say Jim Crow South when Jim Crow started in the North. There were Jim Crow cars in New England in the 30s and 40s, and he and Frederick Douglass, who was from Maryland, did experience that discrimination. Okay, let's talk about Virginia and Maryland. So, as you know, in the Chesapeake Bay, there were also indentured servants, and they did work alongside the black slaves. Often these indentured servants would do this, yeah, the same work, but they would die in servitude because their allotted time as servants would keep getting extended, so that they would die in servitude. And yeah, they some of them tried to escape. So servitude, and which would add to their sentence. These indentured servants, many of them also from the British Isles, would be the servants of the aristocrats in Virginia. But those who survived their term would be relatively well off. And they would have the opportunity to themselves to become rich in Virginia and Maryland. Um, then we, sorry, I feel like I could explain this better, but um, there's certainly more details that I'm missing out. But I liked how the author David Hackett Fischer became more personal in this book compared to Albion Seed, which was over 30 years ago. He talks about how he's from Maryland and how he feels like a little cultural connection to this type of slavery, and maybe even a little shame that of some of the cruelties that went on in really all of the colonies, but you could say some more than others. And um, David Hackett Fischer also talked about how he and his wife went to Africa in 1997 and just explored the different regions in Africa. Um, Talked a lot about the Igbo people. Well, that was just one tribe, right? And many of these Igbos would go, and the Yoruba would, they're from like Nigeria. They would they were one of those ethnic groups that went to the Chesapeake Valley. There's also the Asante. Oh man, this is what happens when you review the book over a week after you finish it instead of right away. I can't name all the different tribes, but he really went through. He did a lot of tourism in '97 with his wife to explore the Africans there in Africa, and then it would give him a better understanding of the quote unquote African American culture today. And then we have New Netherland. Now, New Netherland's really interesting because it's towards the end of the book of Albion that he mentions New Netherland, but here this is more towards the middle. And New Netherland was, about money. These guys were entrepreneurial, and everything was about everything could be negotiated as long as money was on the table. So these guys were the most willing to allow their slaves to purchase their freedom. Like everything was essentially tolerated in New Netherland because it's all about money. And maybe you could make the case for New York, but now with a lot of immigration, especially a lot of immigration in New York, illegal immigration in New York, you have um like illegal migrants filling up public schools, and even this famous radio host from the Breakfast Club. His name is Charlemagne the God. He was being called by many people in his neighborhood saying this is not good. These illegal migrants are taking up the schools, um and my kid has to stay home that's from school. So New York is certainly changing with immigration. It's always been a diverse place, probably the most diverse place in North America. It's the largest concentration of Jews, and um, and those Jews, you could say, always this pulled New York to the left. Like you would have, let's say, Protestant Republicans in the north, which is technically upstate New York, and you would have also a lot of Catholics in the south. I'm thinking, especially Italians, but it was the Jews who and yeah, those guys, those Catholics would vote Democrat traditionally, while the Protestant Republicans in the upstate would vote Republican. But now, um, but the Jews are being always pulled New York City to the far left, and although it's been about money, well, I don't know if it's about money anymore because uh, with all these illegal immigrants coming. But back then, during the days of New Netherland, everything was about money. I mean, and also during the American War for the Southern War for Independence, many New York City people were sympathized with the South, or at least didn't want to be involved in the war. And the mayor at the time was threatening to secede from both the United States and from Albany, the capital of New York State, because the Yankees in upstate New York supported the war much more than the guys from New York City. Not to mention, there were New York City race riots. Hundreds of black men got lynched because many of the the white New York City people, especially those of Irish descent, um, didn't want to be drafted to fight the war. While blacks who were not considered citizens didn't have to be conscripted, or were not subject to conscription. But yeah, New York. That's what I got from it. Also, a lot of them, a lot of them came from Angola. The African slaves who went to New York, and some of them were Christians already, like Catholics, but um, some also converted to the Dutch Reformed Church, which is the church that Martin Van Buren was a part of. I don't know much about the Dutch Reformed Church other than they were Calvinists, but you can say the same thing about the Puritans and the Presbyterians. They were Calvinists, like followers of John Calvin, who was one of the big reformers during the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. Like not everyone. Like I did a little bit of reading. I don't know too much about the Protestant Reformation as much as I should, but not everyone wanted to follow Martin Luther, who kind of started it. Um, let's talk about um, the Delaware Valley. So, as you know, Quakers and Anabaptists, well, I said Mennonites and like German Mennonites and Hutterites, these guys were Anabaptists, um, to which are supposedly different from the Anglo Baptists or just Baptists in Rhode Island, because yeah, the Baptists from Rhode Island, they have their roots in England, but the the Anabaptists have their roots in uh, the Radical Reformation. Um, and these guys did not believe in infant baptism. They believed only those who actually, like adults, or at least those old enough to actually believe in Jesus Christ, should be baptized. And so these are I guess the majority of the radical reformers. But Quakers are sometimes, like, depending on which scholar you ask, are considered part of the radical reformation as well. But I don't even know much about whether or not they even have sacraments, like the Quakers. Like, I respect Quakers for being anti-war, and also today there are neo Anabaptists who are also anti-war. So that's something I can respect. But going back to the Delaware Valley, Um, you, I mean, sure there was some cruelty, but the Quakers did see that there was a contradiction between being against violence and then also having slaves, which were held by threat of violence. And yeah, the Quakers. I mean, eventually they were the ones who pushed very hard for the abolition of slavery. Um, but at the beginning, especially, like they and the Puritans were of New England were really big slave traders, and but in New York, no, sorry, in the Delaware Valley, you would have a lot. There there definitely was some slave owners who saw the humanity in their slaves, and if I recall correctly, um, this is before you know they outlawed the death penalty there, but or if you murdered someone, then you would get murdered. Then you would like if a slave was murdered by a white man, then the white man would face the death penalty. And often, now this reminds me of also in New England, they followed a lot of the Old Testament in Puritan New England. Um, there's this phrase that's repeated a lot in the Pentateuch, the first five books of the Bible. It says, "An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life." So in New England, that it seemed, at least according to David Hackett Fischer, that the Old Testament um, was very no took a lot of precedence there. And for example, a slave had castrated his master's son. So in at first the New England courts weren't sure what to do because the law at their law at the time did not mention castration, but then the principle of an eye for an eye came about, and well, the legislature told the courts the principle of the eye for an eye came up. So do you know what to do? So because the legislature the courts weren't sure what to do, so they asked the legislature, and then the legislature said, yeah, this is the principle that we follow. So um we so yeah, that slave who had castrated his master's son was castrated. You the and yeah, that's what no, it's not exactly the same in the Delaware Valley, but they did execute. They were white men who did kill a slave were subject to the death penalty themselves, which was not the same thing with um, the southern states, both like Chesapeake Valley and also the deep South, like South Carolina, like the Charleston planters in Georgia. I'll talk about them now. These, especially Charleston, South Carolina. So this is different from borderlands culture, which actually a lot of those guys were poor. The borderlands in the Appalachian Mountains. And Appalachia. What do I say? Even today, I remember seeing this map of how the whites in Appalachia, the counties in those counties, which are majority white, they're still really poor up to this day. But when we're talking, so naturally they wouldn't have many slaves. Meanwhile, meanwhile, sorry, I got a notification on Instagram, and I'm not checking it because I want to get this um, podcast done first. In you would have this difference, like in South Carolina, between um, inland and the coast, and well, especially Charleston. Now, Calhoun wasn't a Charlestonian like his wife, but much of the wealth was in Charleston, and this is where many of the planter, where many people from Barbados, like these were, um, like the grandsons of the sons and grandsons of people from Barbados, which was a ruthless slave society, probably the cruelest of its time in the New World, at least. Maybe all over the world at the time, but um, yeah, South Carolina was a majority black populate state, colony, and then state, and where the white people were always in fear of their lives, and they were always armed, even when they went to church. Meanwhile, the the so a lot of them, and this culture also spread to Georgia. Georgia wasn't as big of a slave society back then. In fact, like blacks and slavery were banned at the very beginning, but then people from Charleston brought their slaves to Georgia. A lot of these slaves um, faced severe consequences if they ran away and got caught. They would be mutilated, um, even castrated, or they would face the death penalty eventually. But those that did escape went all the way to Florida, because at the time Florida was controlled by Spain, and Spain may have had slavery, but it wasn't as black focused, as in there was no distinction between, like, let's say, the indigenous slaves and the black slaves. I'll get to them very shortly, but for now, um, for now, oh, sorry, I'm having a hard time thinking. Um, I'll talk about Michelle Obama, who David Hackett Fischer brings up several times. Um, then in South Carolina, there was this community of former slaves called, and they came up with their own language, which shared a lot of words with English, but it also took from various African languages. It was called Gullah, and then its cousin was called Geechee, but Gullah is the most popular, I guess, African American language even today. But yeah, there was this community, I think it was on an island, and of Gullah speaking slaves, and much of the vocabulary is English, but the grammar is pretty different, which is why it's why most people, including Hackett Fischer, consider Gullah a separate language from English. And Geechee is another one. Then let's talk about and Michelle Obama is descended from Gullah speakers. I mean, she's a mix of some other tribes, I think, or other. But near the end of the book, she talks brings up um David Hackett Fischer in the brings up how in the 2016 Democratic National Convention, Michelle Obama use the words, when they go low, we go high, um, which is a reflection of her culture as a quote unquote African American, descended of the Gullah people. And I'm not doing a good job explaining, sorry, but that is um the but it's more like we but that phrase, when they go low, we go high, it's trying to like not go, she's basically saying we do not go to the down to the others standards. We are up here and they are down there. And it's, I guess she's implying that those people who were in favor of Trump were against quote unquote African Americans or black people. Now, the next one, um so yeah, I mentioned Florida. Let's talk about the Florida Seminoles. um so really, they're generally considered two groups of Seminoles. They're the Indian Seminoles. I don't really like that term either, because they're not from India. This is back when Christopher Columbus mistakenly called the natives of the Americas Indians, but they're not from India, because he thought they were. He landed in India, but he didn't. And even today, now, people still use that term, even though I don't like it, obviously, because they're not from India. And and it's funny because here in North America, when you say Asian, you also often, a lot of people exclude Indians, and they only refer to East Asians or South Asians. But it's like, dog, Indians can't be Indian here, and they can't be Asian here either. Like, what's wrong with people? What's wrong with this society? Well, at least in Britain, they refer to Rishi Sunak as the first Indian, oh, sorry, the first Asian prime minister. Even though, like, I think that's not good either. Like, if you said the first Hindu prime minister, sure. But Asian, it's like the UK is not part of Asia, so it's kind of like it's a different part of geography. Um, call another notification, whatever. Um, what is it? Um, but yeah, the Indian Seminoles and the African Seminoles. The African Seminoles were the people who ran away ran away from Georgia and South Carolina. And then there were three Seminole wars. The first, I think the first one was involved, like, it's like 1815 to 1818 with Andrew Jackson. Then the second one involved Zachary Taylor. And Zachary Taylor, this is like, I think, in the 1820s. Um, After the war, he respected them. And then the third one, from 1855 to 58, involved Taylor's son-in-law. Um, what's his name? Jefferson Davis, who was at the time Secretary of State under Franklin Pierce. And um these guys were like the African Seminole culture survived, although some of them did get kidnapped and were brought back to slavery. Actually, one of George Washington's slaves was an African Seminole in Florida, but then he got recaptured and like he was freed by George Washington, and then he didn't. He was recaptured. But yeah, that's Sorry, I'm not doing a good job explaining this, but yeah, the African Seminole culture was also a warrior culture, and after after the Third Seminole War, a few years after, they um some of them fought for the Union, and one of the leaders of the African Seminoles in the Third Seminole War um was did not want to ally himself with Jefferson Davis after fighting a war against him. Although I don't think he ever got to personally meet Jefferson Davis, but yeah, he spurned an alliance with the Confederate States and fought for the Union. Fought with on the side of the Union at the time. Um, but others, yeah, they went further west after the Third Seminole War. Like they went to um, Texas and what's now um, Oklahoma. And yeah, some did experience um, bad treatment from both whites and the native peoples. And then let's talk about Louisiana. Um, Louisiana was first controlled by the French, then the Spanish for 60 years, and then the French again. Before I don't remember for 60 years, but like French for a few years under Napoleon before he sold it to um, the United States. So during the first under French rule, it was a centralized rule, like the essentially the in France at the time, the king had centralized power. Um, and but Louisiana was actually really founded by French Canadians who came, but then you know they independently developed their own cultures, like especially after Quebec was taken over by France. Well, French Canadians didn't just include Quebecers; it also included uh, Acadians, Acadiens. Sorry, my French pronunciation is horrible. Um, from who were in like New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and yeah, people from French Canada, essentially, went to Louisiana to start that colony. And yeah, there was no separation of church and state there, and that's why today parishes are Louisiana has parishes instead of counties. Um, and yeah, the slaves, many of those slaves were Catholics, and they developed another uh, language there. It's like a Creole called, and sometimes it's called gumbo, unless, which is based on French, but it also takes other elements, including from Spanish and from African culture, African and Native American languages. And I remember talking to this one woman who spoke Haitian Creole, and then I asked her, "Does she understand Louisiana Creole?" And then she says, "Oh no, but they can understand me." However, I'm going to New Orleans in a few days, so I think I would be able to pick it up. Because yeah, Haitian Creole is also based on French, but takes from African languages essentially. I remember my friend, who's Jamaican, speaks patois, which is he refers to it as a dialect of English because Jamaican patois because yeah it's English for the most part, but then like a lot of people in Jamaica pushed for it because for it to be recognized as an official language in Jamaica because Haitians had Creole, and like it's under the same basis. It's like uh, takes um elements from other African languages. But yeah, there's Louisiana Creole, but then he really talks more about gumbo. David Hackett Fischer mostly talks about gumbo, and when you first search up gumbo on the internet, you see this um dish with rice and beans, corn, and shrimp. But yeah, there's also a gumbo language, and that was like if you want to call it the Creole, I'm not sure if it's the same as Louisiana Creole. There's probably some overlap, but yeah, it's also descended from African languages, uh, mostly influenced by French, but also by Spanish. Most of the people who speak like those of Spanish descent in Louisiana supposedly come from the Canary Islands. So, um, not I guess not from the Iberian Peninsula in Europe, like where Spain is. Um, but yeah, and Catholicism is pretty big. Was pretty big there and still is now, even for the slaves. And even though it was technically illegal, there were still some priests who performed marriages between whites and blacks. I mean, like the church doesn't make a distinction when it comes to race. Church rules, anyways. And but there were these things called code noir, black codes in France, but it's like perhaps not as strict compared to some other. Certainly not as strict compared to South Carolina or Georgia. But yeah, um, let's talk about like I guess Texas and Oklahoma, which were many people uh, descended from Louisiana, African, uh, Florida Creole, African Florida. What do I just talked about it? Seminoles, and some of them did earn the respect of the whites and the natives there. Um, and sometimes they would even fight the Mexicans, especially after the war. They would get into like standoffs with the communities, and sometimes they would like one guy gets murdered, and then um, in like one like Seminole guy gets murdered, and then the rest of the guys in this community go after the Mexicans. Um, I'm kind of fuzzy on the ideas, but you would certainly there's some discrimination, but there's also some respect going on between natives or even like white peoples compared to like in defense of like Texas defense against um Mexicans certainly. But yeah, um it's been almost 50 minutes now. I um I'll talk about like what's going on in the news. Like I think the couple of episodes ago I talked about how Danielle Smith was the premier of Alberta, and she reminds me of the people in the Carolinians during the nullification crisis. Guys like Henry Hamilton, who was the governor at the time, Robert Hayne, who was the senator, but then when Calhoun stepped down from the vice presidency, Hayne became the governor, and Calhoun, so that Calhoun could take his seat in the U.S. Senate. And yeah, they were nullifying. But see, the thing is, the legislature in South Carolina didn't nullify it by itself. Nullify the the tariffs and later the force bill by themselves. What they did is have a nullification convention, and that's what Calhoun believed, that it should be a convention by the people. But of course, it's different, at least in Alberta. Um, she like last year or the year before, Premier Smith passed the Unite Alberta Sovereignty Act within a united Canada. And recently the Alberta government used it against the federal electricity price regulations. And I think that was the first time. Like this was last month. Like if this is March, I think they used it in February. So I like that. And then recently on a Brian McClanahan podcast, I think that his episode was titled "Utah Tells the Federal Government to Pound Sand." Um, People from Utah were taking inspiration, like the Utah state legislators were taking inspiration from Daniel Smith's act in Alberta, and I found that really fascinating. Um, this is we're both federations, Canada and the United States, so we can certainly learn from each other when it comes to checking federal power. Now, certainly, there are people who don't think that Smith is conservative enough, particularly on social issues. But I mean, also on healthcare. I think she needs. People believe she needs to be more free market and less central planning when it comes to Alberta's healthcare. Um, hmm. I mean, well, we'll see. Um, like I do like Alberta, like Alberta's free market culture a lot, and um, what I like especially is that there is no provincial sales tax here in Ontario, where I live. The PST is 8%, and if you combine that with the federal GST, which is 5%, you get a 13% sales tax. But in Alberta, it's only you only are subject to the 5% GST, because there is no sales tax. I remember during the 2022 leadership race, um, one of the the rivals for the leadership race, Brian Jean, who I think eventually came third. He he was he was saying he was dead set against the PST, and then he wanted everyone, including Smith, it was like all of his rivals, including Smith, to proclaim no PST, no PST, take a stand and say no PST. The PST is really a regressive tax. It'll worse than inflation, and it will harm the lower classes disproportionately more than the upper classes. So he always said no PST, no. He was always pushing no PST, and it got me thinking about, oh wow, they don't have a PST, and I searched up the rest of the Canadian provinces do have a PST, and I'm like, okay, well, I mean, can't blame me for wanting to move to Alberta, but like, remember, we live in a federation where each of the provinces has their own cultures, and even within the provinces, there's more than one culture, depending on which community you choose to live in. Um, I know recently, also, immigration's also been a big thing. Canada has been taking in more legal immigrants than America recently. Well, you can say that's partly due to COVID, for sure. Like America didn't. I think it was only last year that Joe Biden removed his COVID vaccine mandate for foreigners to come into the United States, while Canada um, removed it several months earlier. But yeah, I think last year or the year before, like 1 million people came to Canada, and that's way too much. Now, I remember Tim Moen saying he doesn't like the idea of one um like one central government like centrally planning and figuring out some magic number to cap immigration. And I don't disagree. Immigration here in Canada is a shared jurisdiction. If you look at Section 95 of the Constitution Act of 1867, formerly known as the British North America Act, Section 95 states that immigration and agriculture are shared jurisdictions. Both the federal government and the provinces are in control. But however, the provinces cannot pass a law that contradicts what the feds have to say. Um, and I remember during COVID, he was the premier of Quebec, Francois Legault, was pushing. No, also had like was exercising power over immigration. Um, so yeah, I remember. But when you say immigration now, like everyone's thinking of the southern border in the United States and how um, while Biden is violating his oath um, to the U.S. Constitution because the president is supposed to execute the laws of the U.S. That Congress passes, and that includes immigration laws. And he was getting in the way of Texas um, doing it. Texas guarding their border and doing what they want on state property. So if it was federal property, some people would make that distinction and say there is a difference. But even then, it's Texas wanted to enforce this federal immigration law, and Biden was not doing his duty. He was getting in the way actually. So um, the feds. So that's and what's his name? Sided the court. So the three liberals and then John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett sided with Biden, but then 25 other governors um, sided, like basically all the Republican governors except for the one in Vermont sided with um, Texas Governor Greg Abbott. So I remember, so people think like the tension between like the red and the blue is much bigger than it is and between, like, let's say the Yankees and the Southerners during 1860 and 61. And I say this because the Yankees and the Southerners were majority Christian at the time. But now the red states are majority Christian, and you could say even some of the blue states, but it's like they they're a lot they have not all of not all of them are like very devout Christians. And some of them identify as Christians, but they don't have the social and cultural values that a traditional Christian would. Um, and also, I don't want to make this about red and blue as too much either. Even within the blues, like let's take two extremes. Um, Patrick Leahy from Vermont and um, Joe Manchin from West Virginia. Joe Manchin is considered on the right wing of the party. But both of these guys are Catholics, by the way. Joe Manchin is like a moderate conservative. He sees himself as he always talks about how he is the heir to Robert Byrd, um, which is kind of weird because Robert Byrd was a mentor to Hillary Clinton when they were both in the Senate together. But whatever. Um, and then Patrick Leahy, who is senator from Vermont, and he's unlike Manchin, he's not pro-life. I'm sure he supports how his state made it essentially a constitutional right in their constitution to have an abortion, while is while the West Virginia Democrats are happy with Joe Manchin being pro-life. This is a reflection of the culture in their state. So I don't want to say it's so much about red and blue. Let's also talk about Nikki Haley. There's a clip going around in 2010 about Nikki Haley being asked. Well, this is when she was running for governor. Um, do you believe that states can secede from the union? And then she said, "Yes, I do, and I believe that's what the Constitution says." It's exactly what the Constitution explicitly says, but if it does not prohibit the states from doing it, then they can do it. This was how those the Constitution was sold at the ratifying conventions, and it was put there in clearer terms, not in terms like in not on actual paper in on the 10th Amendment when that was ratified in 1791. So it doesn't explicitly say that, as Nikki Haley might have said in 2010, but then um, honestly, if you are like, let's say, Texas or any other state that wants to secede, California, Vermont, New Hampshire, you do want someone like 2010 Nikki Haley to be president. However, she is a notorious flip flopper, and then what she did, she caved to the left in 2015 in South Carolina by removing the battle flag from like the state capitol or something. I don't remember all the rules. I remember in '98, another Republican governor did that. He caved to the left, or maybe compromised with them on the battle flag, and he was soundly defeated in his election because of that. Um, and this is Republican governor. He for his weakness on the battle flag. So then, fast forward to today. Nikki Haley is running against Donald Trump to become president nominee of the GOP, and I don't think she's gonna get it. There's a lot of money that's trying to prop her up, but everyone's like, no, not many people like her. Like, she recently lost in her home state of South Carolina to Donald Trump. Like, South Carolinians remember that she took down the flag. It's like, does she not remember 98? Well, what happened in 98? So, and she's she's a Southerner. You can hear that in her accent. I mean, people attack her because she's descended. No, her parents are Sikh immigrants from India, but like, that's not what matters. What matters is what she did in 2015 and what she's doing right now, which is flip flopping. She was on the Breakfast Club, which I mentioned before, and Charlemagne the God pressed her on this. He showed her the clip from 2010, and then he said, "Yes, I believe in," and she kept affirming, "I believe in states' rights. I believe in states' rights. If Texas wants to leave, if the whole state wants to leave, then I will. Then they can do that. The state can do what it wants." So, I mean, she backtracks on this because she's a flip flopper, like a lot of politicians. But I mean, if you were to say, like I said, 2010 Nikki Haley, then yeah, you would want someone like 2010 Nikki Haley to be in president if you wanted your state to secede from the union. One last thing, there's recently this new bill that the Trudeau government is putting on, like it's an online hate speech bill where you can get fined or imprisoned for things you say online. Yeah. Yeah, obviously people can't wait to get rid of him, but he currently, there's a confidence and supply agreement with the NDP. I think I've mentioned this before. Like, the Conservatives, who are the official opposition, keep saying that it is an NDP Liberal coalition. Most scenarios in coalitions, the members from both parties are in the cabinet, and often the deputy leader, the deputy prime minister would be the leader of the second biggest part of the second biggest party of the coalition. However, and like, let's look at the elections of 2010 and 2017 in the UK, which is the home country. This is where Canada's roots are. So 2010, Labour loses because at that time, Gordon Brown was the prime minister. So the Labour Party loses, but the Conservative Party does not have a majority yet. What happens is they ask the another party, the Liberal Democrats, to be in a coalition. So from 2010 to 2015, David Cameron's the prime minister, but the deputy prime minister was Nick Clegg, I think. He was the leader of the Liberal Democrats. Then I think 2015 to 2017, you have the Conservatives get a majority government. So yeah, no longer needing the Liberal Democrats. David Cameron's still prime minister, but then the 2016 Brexit referendum happens and it goes through, and Cameron resigns, and so you have Theresa May. So 2017 comes, and she calls a snap election in 2017, and then which she didn't need to do, but now then she's reduced to a minority, and then the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, which is based in Northern Ireland, agreed to prop her up. So this is called a confidence and supply agreement. And this is essentially what the NDP are doing with the Liberals, because in the confidence and supply, you don't really have members of, or like at least traditionally, the members of the smaller party does not are not in the cabinet. They're just agreeing to prop them up, like so that during like the budget or during bills that can bring down a government, they will make sure to support the government so that the party has um the most seats, well, has a majority of the seats, and therefore they will not be toppled. So this is what is going on. The NDP, Liberal, I know the Conservative Party keeps saying it. It's a coalition, but it's not really a coalition. It's confidence and supply, because the NDP do not have the do not actually have a seat in the cabinet. But yeah, people are saying Jagmeet Singh wants his pension. Oh, and I think in order to have a pension, you need to be there for six. You need to be a member of parliament for 6 years, which Jagmeet Singh doesn't have that yet. He entered the parliament in 2019, and the weird thing is he's from Ontario, but then he moved to Burnaby in 2019 because he became federal NDP leader in 2018. So then in 2019, 2018 or 2017, after as Mulcair had lost his like vote of confidence at the NDP convention. So then he went to 2020 he ran for a by-election in 2019 in Burnaby, which is in Burnaby South, which is in British Columbia. And then basically he's 2019, he'll have his pension in 2025. So he's just gonna do that. Like it's kind of dirty politics. He's saying that he's pressuring the Liberals for pharmacare, as in, I mean, obviously I'm not in favor of federal involvement in like, pharmacare. Obviously, I believe in the free market, and I'm not in favor of federal involvement in healthcare either. I mean, obviously, like I don't want my province either in it involved, but certainly I don't like the Canada Health Act, which does restrict the provinces in a certain way. There just should I don't believe there should be a Canada Health Act. Like if we're told that that healthcare is a provincial jurisdiction, then there should be no federal legislation. Period. When it comes to healthcare. So yeah, but now it's pharmacare, and he's the thing is, it's not it's not just that Jagmeet Singh wants his pension. It's also the NDP are supposedly broke and they don't have money for a new election. They're not prepared at all. But they have the power to trigger it because they're propping up the Liberals. But it's not going to happen because they're also not high on the polls. Right now, the Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is high in the polls. Or another thing is I mean, maybe some people won't like me saying this, but like the conservative party under Pierre Poilievre is kind of Girondin. If you don't know, during the French Revolution, the Jacobins, like the members of the Club of Saint Jacob or something, were like the two main, I guess, groups were the of Jacobin were the Girondins and La Montagne. So the La Montagne were further on the left, and they were also like divided into three smaller groups. And then the Girondins were the moderate revolutionaries who believed that it should stop at some point. But I mean, many of them got their heads chopped off by members of La Montagne. Of course, members of the La Montagne also chopped each other's heads off. But the point I'm making is that the Overton window is kind of really on the left, so the he's being pretty moderate. Pierre Poilievre, like he moderated his stance on abortion, for example, like for over a decade, like from his election in 2004 until like around 2020, when he was considering running for leader of the Conservative Party, he would state that he's pro-life, but then when it came down to running for leader, he's like, okay, I'm pro-choice. And then his wife, who immigrated to Montreal from Venezuela, is also like pro-choice. And then she a few months ago she had an interview talking about how we, like her family, is from Quebec, and these are being pro-choice is Quebec values. So there's that, and then there's also immigration. How they are not the conservatives are not linking immigration to the housing crisis that we have on, like in the sense that he said they're only saying we need to build more houses, and Pierre Poilievre, what he's going to do is tell cities that they need to remove their zoning rules so that more houses can be built. And I don't like the feds telling the cities what to do. Like it's one thing for the provinces to do that, which I kind of don't like either, because it's not in the spirit of decentralization. But the feds telling the cities to do that is not good. It's like clearly out of out of federal jurisdiction for them to tell the cities what to do. Um, and then yeah, everyone wants him just to come out and say wants Pierre Poilievre to come out and say we have too many immigrants, and this is pushing up the demand for readily available housing. But we don't. But he only wants to create more houses. He doesn't want to really cap immigration, which, like I said before, it's not necessarily a good thing for the central government to come up with a number. I'd rather provinces come up with their own numbers. So like there are 10 provinces to 10 numbers, let's say, and like the PEI and Newfoundland are gonna have completely different values from Ontario and Quebec, let's say, and even between those two pairs, they're gonna want different values. And like most of the immigrants are going to either the Greater Toronto area or the Greater Vancouver area. But I mean, pretty soon, like more immigrants are gonna go to other places like Alberta. But yeah, um, okay, I've been ranting for almost 80 minutes now. I think I'm gonna call it for today. I have another book. Like I have a lot of books that I'm gonna review on this channel and on this podcast. Like if you're just listening to the audio form, but please look forward to mm, my to new episodes. I intend to put several more this year. Perhaps not monthly. Like I tried to do monthly for a few when I first started, but it wasn't easy. I mean, I do other things, but for those who are listening or watching this podcast, thank you so much. Um, I'm also on Instagram at Illuminatorum, where you can, and then in my description, it's called host of the Canadian Meets the South podcast. So you can follow me there, but I haven't really posted many videos. But yeah, thank you for watching or listening to this podcast. I will catch you guys next time. Bye.